I do believe Carillion was acting as a form of Ponzi scheme. It was knowingly pricing its bids for contracts so low that it knew it wasn't going to make any money from them. So it was basically getting in new money, because you get short-term advance funding when you get a contract, which was helping you to pay the wages and helping you to pay the direct bonuses and helping you to pay the dividends to your shareholders. But it's obviously, like any Ponzi scheme, it's not going to be sustainable, because in the end of the day, the money runs out. Carillion had a lot of parallels with RBS. It was run by a Scottish chartered accountant. In the case of RBS, the accountant's name was Fred Goodwin. In the case of Carillion, the accountant's name at the time of its collapse was Keith Cochrane. So this is a bean counter running a company. It's not always the best idea. The second parallel was it made loads of acquisitions funded by debt. So it didn't issue new shares to fund these acquired companies. It just borrowed more and more money to fund these acquisitions. It was wholly trusted by government. Both RBS and Carillion were wholly trusted by the government. They shouldn't have been. They were both built on sand. But I think the key thing is the government being asleep. The government, in both cases, in the build-up, should have spotted the warning signs that here was a company that was basically a form of Ponzi scheme, and thought, hey, why is it safe for us to be so dependent on this to supply so many schools, prisons, hospitals, road projects, etc., etc. They are a group of very large accountancy firms whose global turnovers range from about 25 to 40 billion US dollars. They're massive, behemoths, which were originally accountancy firms. That was their main thing. When they were founded back in the Victorian era, they were basically doing the accounts and adding up the numbers or checking the financial reports of their clients. And they generally did that okay. But in about the 80s, they suddenly became incredibly greedy and full of themselves and decided to relaunch themselves as business services conglomerates or supermarkets. So rather than just doing the accounts, they'd suddenly become management consultants as well, so advising companies on its strategy. They'd suddenly also they got into law. They acquired law firms, so they got into doing legal work. They got into tax advisory, tax consultancy, which basically is advising companies on how to minimize their tax bill, to structure themselves in a particular way, like having lots of offshore companies through which they can masquerade, so they can massage profits through loans, through complex web of loans and transfers of cash. They basically became horrendously conflicted, the big four consultancies. Deloitte's, PwC, which stands for PricewaterhouseCoopers, EY, which stands for Ernst & Young, and the smallest one is KPMG, which was originally called Thomson McClintock. So these giant firms basically have hoovered up a lot of their rivals, and they are kind of unassailable. And they're now called the Final Four, which means that there's a fear in government that you cannot allow one of these companies to fail, because if there's only three left, the lack of competition in their sector of auditing large corporations and providing some of those other services to large corporations will be even less competitive, even more of an oligopoly than it currently is. So government is almost is being held to ransom to some extent around the world by these big four firms, in that when they do commit crimes like KPMG did in the States over tax shelters, and was going to be criminally prosecuted by the US authorities and effectively shut down like Anderson was. In the end of the day, the government gets cold feet and says, oh, we'll just make them pay a fine and we'll have a few other sanctions, but we can't criminally prosecute KPMG, because if we do, it will go down the tubes, just like, as I said, Anderson will. And then we're only left with three. It's hard to find any member of the big four firms which doesn't have a conflict of interest with Carillion, because they've got their tentacles into so many areas. They could be advising on PPP projects that Carillion is involved with. They could be advising the pension fund, which basically has a totally different agenda to the company, because the pension scheme is about protecting the assets in the pension scheme and ensuring the pensioners get paid. They could be doing, any number of different things. So the possibility of getting any member of the Big Four, which is wholly unconflicted, to do the Carillion liquidation, to advise the official receiver on the Carillion liquidation, is out of the question. RBS was involved as a main lender, one of the main lenders to Carillion, and the total money owed by Carillion to its banks and to other entities is 2.2 billion. The exact figure that is owed to RBS hasn't been divulged yet, I don't think. But basically, it's around about 400 million, I would imagine. RBS's involvement was basically to be comatose as a lender. It wasn't actually monitoring the company's performance sufficiently well from when the trouble started to brew back in when was it? Back, quite a few years ago. It was, I think, asleep at the wheel as a lender, but it just kept, as far as I'm aware, kept lending more money and was getting cold feet when it heard about these profit warnings in July 2017 and the subsequent 2 profit warnings. I'd imagine they were suddenly thinking, hey, we've got a lot of exposure here. What are we going to do about it? And they didn't do a full GRG kneecap job on Carillion. They didn't suddenly remove all the lending, because if they had, they would probably have been blamed for causing it to collapse. So they've been, in terms of their treatment of Carillion subsequent to the problems emerging, they have not been as bad, in my view, as they were with SMEs under the GRG banner. But what they did do was they effectively changed the terms for they wanted prepayment to suppliers, and they wanted to bring the payment forward by 2 days, which actually would have caused a 2 million to a 20 million pound loss of liquidity within Carillion. And that in itself is being blamed by Keith Cochrane, who ran the company at the time of its collapse, as something which fueled its demise. So they have been accused of fueling its demise. The other thing they did last weekend was they are reported to have effectively held a gun to the head of Theresa May's government, especially to David Lidington, who was leading the negotiations last weekend, and basically told him that, yes, we will lend more, but we will only do it if you give a form of bailout or some kind of guarantee, to the additional money that we would lend under such circumstances. And to their credit, the government of Theresa May said no. They said, no, we're not going to succumb to your threats. We're going to put this company into liquidation. So I'm not a fan of Theresa May's government generally, but in this instance, I believe they've done the right thing by putting it into liquidation. I think a bailout would have been a disaster. Companies which have genuinely failed through mismanagement have to be allowed to fail. Otherwise, you can't have capitalism. There's a saying that banking without failure is like Catholicism without hell, because basically there's no fear of things going wrong. There's a huge moral hazard, which means you think, oh, I can screw this up, and I can gouge out and loot this business for as much money as I want, more or less, in terms of salary, bonus, LTIP, etc., etc. And if it all goes tits up, the government's going to bail it out anyway, and I'll just walk off with my swag bag intact into the sunset, which is what happened in the banking crisis. I blame the Bank of England to some extent, because back in the 19th century, when Barclays was growing through a series of acquisitions, the Bank of England did nothing to stop it, because it was more convenient to the Bank of England to have one large bank to supervise than loads of little small tiddly banks. So it quite welcomed the agglomeration that happened way back in the Victorian era when Barclays was on the acquisition trail. So regulators almost welcome these huge conglomerates because they think they are easier to police or supervise. That's not obviously always the case. I mean, in the US, they actually do have much stronger antitrust rules and laws than we have in the UK. And so you saw that with Standard Oil. When Standard Oil became so vast that it was basically holding the US population to ransom and could charge what it wanted for petrol, or what they call it gasoline. The UK federal government in Washington stepped in and broke it up. Likewise with Bell, the telephone company, it was getting too big and it was becoming a monopoly, and it was therefore able to rip off the customers because it had too much power. There weren't any real competitors. So that was broken up into the so-called baby bells. And in the EU, they have quite good antitrust regulators who have been, to their credit, pretty tough on firms like Microsoft and Google. Unfortunately, in the UK, we have a very toothless organization called, well, it used to be called the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, and now it's called the Competition and Markets Authority, which is so feeble that, when it looked at the banking sector recently, it didn't advocate a break-up of some of the larger banks, which is what should happen, in my view. It just advocated, they should do more to do with open banking and APIs, basically where they provide customer information to other organizations, which might be tech companies. And yeah, maybe that could have an effect. That might increase competition in the banking sector, but it's not the obvious solution. I think it's going to be quite serious, because I think they're doing a sellotape and scissors. They're doing a patch-up job at the moment. They're trying to, prop up different parts of the Carillion empire. But I think it's going to have a serious impact on a lot of suppliers to Carillion, a lot of subcontractors to Carillion who will perhaps go bankrupt, a lot of staff who will obviously lose their jobs, 19,000 in the UK and over 40,000 worldwide. So yeah, I think we haven't seen any of the fallout from the Carillion collapse yet. I believe it will sadly get worse.